Hey there. Are you ready to lose yourself in a world of darkness and chilling tales? Go ahead, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the shadows pull you in. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments when and where are you watching from. Let's see how far this darkness can spread. The air was thick with the smell of rain that afternoon, the kind of rain that leaves a damp, lingering scent on everything it touches. It clung to the gravestones, settling into the cracks of the old marble and soaking into the earth like tears from the sky. I stood alone in Greenwood Cemetery, deep in Brooklyn, in front of Nathan's grave, staring blankly at the wet soil that covered his final resting place. It had been 2 long, excruciating weeks since the accident. 2 weeks since my entire world had been ripped away from me in an instant. There was a hollow ache inside me, a gaping hole where my heart should have been, as if someone had scooped out my very soul and left nothing but an empty shell behind. I didn't know why I had come. I wasn't expecting closure or comfort from standing there. I didn't expect answers or even peace, but I had nowhere else to go. The days had blurred together in a haze of grief, my mind circling the same thoughts over and over again, trapped in a loop of what-ifs and regrets. Maybe I had come to this place, to Nathan's grave, hoping that being close to him, even like this, might offer something, some sign, some connection. But the silence weighed heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing just far enough away that I hadn't seen him at first. He was tall, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, and he wore a long, dark coat that blended into the gray gloom of the cemetery. He wasn't visiting a grave. There were no flowers, no sign of mourning, no personal connection to this place. He was just there, standing and watching, his presence strange and unnerving but not overtly threatening. Not at first. As if feeling my eyes on him, the man started walking toward me. His movements were slow, deliberate, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. When he finally stopped a few feet away, he studied me with eyes that were dark, unreadable, as though they could see straight through me. "You cared for him, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his voice rough and gravelly, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The grief in my chest, the tears in my eyes said enough. The man watched me for a long moment, then spoke again. "What if I told you there was a way to bring him back?" I let out a sharp laugh, the sound bitter and painful, catching in my throat. It was the first time I'd laughed, if you could even call it that, since Nathan had been taken from me. "There's no way to bring him back," I said, my voice cracking with the weight of loss. "He's gone. He's gone." The words felt like sharp edges against my tongue, stabbing at the raw wound that had opened in my chest the day I lost him. But the man only shook his head, slowly, methodically, his lips curling into a smile that felt wrong, unnatural. "Not everyone who leaves stays gone," he said softly, as if sharing a secret that shouldn't be spoken aloud. There was something in the way he said it, a strange and almost eerie confidence that made my skin prickle with unease. I should have walked away right then and there. I should have turned and left without another word. But grief makes you do strange things. It blinds you to reason. It makes you reach for anything that promises even the smallest sliver of hope, no matter how impossible, no matter how dangerous. He told me about a ritual, An old, forbidden practice, one steeped in ancient traditions. Something drawn from Kabbalistic teachings, though twisted into something far darker than its original intent. The ritual, he explained, had the power to pull a soul from beyond, to bring back what had been lost. I should have questioned him more. I should have known there would be a cost. But I didn't care. I didn't care about anything except the possibility that I could have Nathan back, even for just a moment. Grief had clouded my mind, suffocating all reason. That night, with trembling hands and a heart pounding with both fear and desperate hope, I returned to the cemetery. The mist hung thick in the air, swirling around me like ghostly fingers as I made my way back to Nathan's grave. The world was eerily still. The only sound my own footsteps and the distant hum of the city, muffled by the thick blanket of fog that enveloped everything. I followed the man's instructions carefully, lighting the candles in a circle around the grave, reciting prayers in Hebrew, words that felt foreign and ancient on my tongue. And then, the final step, an offering. I pricked my finger with the small blade, watching as the blood welled up and dripped onto the soil, staining it dark red. I closed my eyes and begged. I begged Nathan to come back. I pleaded with the universe, with the powers that be, with anyone, anything that might be listening. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as though the world had stopped in that moment, waiting. At first, nothing happened. The wind stirred the branches of the trees overhead. A siren wailed faintly in the distance, and I could hear the sound of my own breath, ragged and uneven in the heavy stillness. But then, I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely more than a murmur carried on the breeze, but then it grew louder, clearer, and it was calling my name. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. And there, at the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the reach of the candlelight, stood Nathan. Or at least something that looked like him. My chest tightened, my pulse racing as I took in the familiar sight of him. His hair tousled just the way I remembered, his warm brown eyes gazing back at me. But something was wrong. Deep down, I knew it immediately. His movements were slow, stiff, unnatural, as though each step he took was forced, like a puppet being pulled along by invisible strings. "Sarah," he said, but his voice, it wasn't right. It was too low, too guttural, like the sound was being dragged out of him against his will. Tears blurred my vision as I ran toward him, my heart aching with the overwhelming need to hold him, to touch him again. But when I reached him, when my hands found his skin, I recoiled. He was cold, unnaturally cold, like ice beneath my fingertips. And the smile he gave me, it wasn't Nathan's. It was too wide, too sharp, a grin that stretched unnervingly across his face, filled with a darkness that chilled me to the bone. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. This wasn't Nathan. Whatever the man in the coat had brought back, it wasn't him. It was something else, something darker, something that had taken his form, wearing his face like a mask. The thing that looked like Nathan reached for me, pulling me close, its breath cold against my skin as it whispered in my ear, its voice low and menacing, laced with something hungry. "You called for me," it said, "and now I'm never leaving." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, lost in the vast emptiness of the cemetery. There was no one to hear, no one to save me from the thing I had unleashed. And in that moment I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The night was suffocating, the kind of thick, sticky heat only a Philly summer can deliver. The humidity clung to me, seeping into my pores like sweat mixed with the stench of gasoline. Med school was less than 2 weeks away at Temple, and this was it. My final shift as an EMT. One last ride before I left this life behind. But fate had other plans. Doesn't it always? It was a little after 2 a.m. when the call came through. Overdose, Rittenhouse Square. I glanced at my partner, Mike, and we shared a knowing look. The kind that only comes from experience. In this city, OD calls were as common as stoplights. When we pulled up, I grabbed the Narcan, assuming this would be routine. A quick save and move on. But something was off. Way off. It wasn't just one person slumped over on the bench, it was 2. They were tangled together, motionless beneath the flickering streetlights that cast long, eerie shadows over the park. A young guy, mid-20s maybe, sat with his head tilted back against the bench, lifeless. Next to him, a girl, just as young, nestled into his chest. Mike crouched next to them, his voice low. "Damn it, Jess, they're cold," he muttered, nudging the guy's arm. "We're too late." We should have stopped there, called it in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. So I started working on them, even though they were beyond saving. It's what we're trained to do, fight for life, even when the odds are stacked against us. The girl drew my attention. Her skin wasn't just pale with death. It had this sickly, ashen tone, like storm clouds churning before a downpour. But what really sent a chill down my spine were the marks. I leaned closer, pulling her gently away from the guy's chest. And that's when I saw them. Jagged bite marks. They crisscrossed her arms, neck, and shoulders, like something had chewed on her. But it wasn't clean, not like a wild animal attack. These bites were too deliberate, too human. The teeth marks were unmistakable, deep and jagged, as if someone had gnawed on her flesh with a feral kind of hunger. Blood had pooled and dried around the wounds, dark and congealed. I reached for her hand to check for any faint signs of life, but that's when her eyes snapped open. "Jesus!" I stumbled back, my pulse racing. Her hand shot out, cold as ice, and latched onto me with a strength that didn't belong to the dead. Her lips curled into a twisted grin, revealing teeth, sharp, unnaturally sharp. "Mike! Mike, get over here!" I screamed, struggling to pull free. The girl sat up, eyes wild, bloodshot, and alive with something far from human. She snarled like a cornered animal. I tugged hard, but her grip was unrelenting. Mike rushed over, grabbing my arm, trying to wrench me free. But she was freakishly strong. Stronger than the 2 of us combined. "Let her go!" Mike yelled, reaching for his radio. But before he could call for backup, the guy on the bench stirred, his eyes opening, cloudy, dead, and hollow, like something dragged him back from the grave. The girl leaned closer to me, her breath putrid, like something decayed. "It's so cold," she rasped, voice wet and gurgling. Then she lunged, her teeth sank into my arm, and I howled in pain. Blood spurted from the wound as I swung wildly, landing a punch square on her face. She barely flinched. Mike reacted faster, smashing his flashlight into her skull. She let go, and I stumbled back, clutching my arm, the warmth of my blood soaking into my sleeve. "We need to move. Now!" Mike shouted, pulling me up. The guy was on his feet now, swaying, his head jerking like a puppet on loose strings. The girl crouched low, growling, her eyes locked on us, ready to pounce again. We bolted for the ambulance, slamming the doors shut just as they charged. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with blood and shaking uncontrollably. Mike was screaming into the radio for backup, but his voice was drowned out by the pounding in my ears. I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were standing there, still as statues. heads tilted unnaturally to the side, grinning with those sharp, monstrous teeth. "Drive, Jess!" Mike shouted, panic rising in his voice. "For God's sake, drive!" I floored it, the tires screeching as we tore down the streets, my arm pulsing with searing pain. All I could think about was how close that bite had come to my neck. Even after treatment, the wound doesn't heal. It festers, black veins creeping up my arm, the skin peeling and rotting. A fever hits me like a freight train burning through my body, but that's not the worst part. The worst part is when I catch my reflection. My eyes, bloodshot, glassy, like theirs. Every night the cold sets in deeper, and the hunger grows. I fight it, but each time I feel myself slipping away. The craving claws at my mind, gnawing at my sanity. And despite everything, I can't help it. I'm starting to smile. I've always found a strange comfort in the sound of my wife softly humming lullabies to our baby through the monitor. After long, stressful days, the melody drifting through the crackle of static became a routine, a small moment of peace amidst the chaos of life. Every night, the same lullaby, gentle and repetitive, would fill our home. That familiar tune was my signal to let go of the day's weight, knowing our baby was being soothed to sleep. Last night, though, something felt off. I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. As I lay in bed, that lullaby began to drift through the monitor again, just as it always did. I listened to it, letting the soft notes pull me closer to sleep. But then, a faint nagging feeling crept in. The humming. It sounded different. The sound wasn't as clear, as though it was coming from much farther away, like the nursery had somehow expanded, pulling the familiar song through a strange, distant tunnel. I sat up a little, groggy, but suddenly more alert, trying to pinpoint what was wrong. The melody itself was the same, unbroken, yet I couldn't shake this growing sense of unease in my chest. Something didn't feel right, and I couldn't figure out why. My eyes drifted to the side, and that's when I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. My wife was lying next to me, fast asleep. Her breathing was slow, deep, completely relaxed. She hadn't moved. She wasn't in the nursery. Yet the humming continued, unwavering, coming from the monitor. I froze. My heart began pounding in my ears, the soft hum now chilling rather than calming. My mind raced to make sense of what I was hearing, but there was only one horrifying conclusion. If my wife was right here, who was in the nursery? Who was humming to our baby? I stared at the monitor, my stomach twisting into knots. The light from the small screen flickered in the dark room, illuminating the soft outline of the nursery. The camera showed our baby peacefully sleeping in the crib, completely undisturbed. The crib was empty except for our child, but the humming continued soft and steady. I thought about waking my wife, but something in me hesitated. I didn't want to scare her, not yet. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was some kind of glitch. Monitors can pick up strange signals sometimes, right? I reasoned with myself, though deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I needed to check. Slowly, I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The humming still echoed through the monitor, soft and sweet, as if beckoning me to the nursery. I tiptoed down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards making my skin prickle with unease. The door to the nursery was ajar, just a sliver of light from the nightlight spilling out into the hall. I paused, heart racing. The humming was clearer now, louder, but still wrong. It wasn't just distant, it was distorted, like whoever was singing wasn't quite human. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, pushing it open just enough to peer inside. There was nothing there. The room was exactly as it should be. Our baby still peacefully sleeping, the mobile gently turning above the crib. But the humming, it wasn't coming from any visible source. It was just there, hanging in the air as though the room itself was humming. A low, vibrating melody that didn't belong. My pulse quickened as I stepped fully into the room. The moment I did, the humming stopped. Silence, cold and sudden, pressed in on me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to nothing but my own ragged breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a step toward the crib, my body tense, every muscle on high alert. The baby stirred slightly but remained asleep, completely unaware of the strange presence that had filled the room just moments ago. And then I heard it again. Faint, distant, like it was moving away. The humming. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the monitor. It was coming from the baby's closet. My heart skipped a beat, a sickening dread pooling in my stomach. The closet door was closed, but the sound was unmistakable. That same sweet, haunting melody now whispered from behind the wooden door, softer, but somehow more menacing. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to grab the baby and get out of the house. But something in that humming, in the way it crawled under my skin, held me in place. It felt like the sound was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. With a shaking hand, I reached for the closet door. My fingers brushed against the cold metal knob, and for a moment, I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to run, but I had to know. I had to see what was behind that door. I twisted the knob slowly, inching the door open. As soon as I did, the humming stopped. I peered inside, my heart hammering in my chest. The closet was empty, nothing but clothes, toys, and darkness. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I backed out of the room, my body tense, feeling like something was right there, just out of sight, lingering in the shadows. I scooped up my baby and hurried back to the bedroom, my heart pounding as I locked the door behind me. I climbed into bed, holding my child close, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. As I lay there, wide awake, I listened to the silence, waiting for the humming to return. I was walking home late one night, the streets eerily deserted, with only the occasional flicker from the street lamps casting long, unsettling shadows. That's when I noticed him, standing in the shadows of a narrow alley, hunched over in a way that instantly felt wrong. He was holding something small, offering it to another man. It wasn't the sight that made me stop, though. It was the feeling, like an invisible force had hooked itself under my skin, pulling me toward them. The figure, if you could still call him human, looked unsettlingly out of place. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if sunlight had never touched it. It clung to his bones unnaturally, tight and drawn, giving him a gaunt, decayed appearance. His clothes, old and worn, seemed to hang loosely, as though they had long since become part of him. Insects crawled freely in and out of his tattered sleeves, scurrying across his neck without him even flinching. But it was his eyes that chilled me the most. Empty, lifeless, like they had long since given up on seeing the world. The other man stood there, transfixed, terrified yet drawn in by whatever was in the pale figure's hand. I couldn't see it clearly from where I stood, but my curiosity got the better of me. I inched closer, pressing myself against the shadows, my heart racing in my chest. That's when I saw it. The pale figure was holding a small, weathered wooden box. He opened it slowly, and inside, an eye stared back, round and unblinking. But it wasn't just an eye. Beneath it, a dark, writhing tendril coiled around it, moving in slow, deliberate patterns as if it were alive. The eye followed the man's gaze, and I could see the fear flooding his face. His awe quickly twisted into terror, but he couldn't pull away. His hands rose to clutch his head as he stumbled backward, but by then, the box had already snapped shut. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. The figure turned toward me, and it was as if he had known I was there all along. His hollow gaze locked onto mine, and in a voice that echoed like a distant whisper, he spoke. "Do you want to see?" I knew I shouldn't have answered. I knew nothing good could come of it. But against all logic, I nodded. Up close, the box was larger than I'd first thought. Heavier, its dark wood etched with strange, intricate symbols I couldn't understand. The latch barely seemed to hold, as though it had been opened and closed countless times before. Slowly, he lifted the lid, and the eye inside locked onto mine instantly. I couldn't look away. The tendril beneath the eye shifted again, writhing in slow circles, as if it were searching for something. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt possibility. A flood of images filled my mind, my deepest desires, my wildest dreams, all within my reach. I could feel them just beyond my grasp, tantalizingly close. But then, the visions soured. Those dreams turned to smoke, slipping through my fingers. A deep, gnawing dread took hold, crawling up my spine. I stumbled back, and the figure closed the box, but it was too late. Something had already taken root inside me. The first day, I convinced myself it had all been a strange, unsettling dream. I tried to forget the encounter, but every time I blinked, I saw it. The eye staring at me from the darkness, watching, waiting. By the second day, strange things started happening. Small at first. A train I always caught was inexplicably delayed. A glass shattered in my hand. But then my phone died, cracked as if something had smashed it. My friends stopped responding to my texts and calls one by one. By the third day, I was unraveling. Everywhere I went, I felt its presence. The eye, always there in my peripheral vision, just out of reach but never truly gone. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't think. It was inside me now, crawling deeper, its whispers growing louder. They were constant, never stopping. Even when I covered my ears, even when I screamed. That night, as I lay in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, I knew sleep wouldn't come. But exhaustion overtook me, and my eyes betrayed me. In the brief moment that I blinked, the eye wasn't just in my thoughts anymore. It was everywhere. It consumed me, pulling me into a dark, endless void where time and reality lost all meaning. I don't know if I'm alive anymore. I don't feel hunger. I don't feel pain. All I see, all I know, is the eye. It's all-consuming, infinite, pulling me deeper into its gaze. I'm trapped here, adrift in a vast darkness where nothing else exists but the steady, unblinking watch of the thing in the box. Then, suddenly, there's light. The box is opened again, and I see faces staring in at me. They don't see me, though. They see what they want to see. Their wildest hopes reflected back at them. I want to scream, to warn them, but I can't. My voice is gone, swallowed by the endless darkness. I'm just another soul now, trapped inside the box, consumed by the thing that waits within. And I know, deep in the pit of whatever remains of me, that they'll be next. My mother was terminally ill and spent her final days confined to a hospital bed. I maintained my usual work routine during the week, but on weekends I would stay by her side, keeping vigil day and night. It became a regular part of my life. Each time I arrived, the nurse assigned to my mother, Claire, would have a pillow and blanket ready for me. Claire became the only source of companionship I had left as I withdrew from everything outside the hospital. My world was reduced to the hospital corridors and my job, and after my mother lost her ability to speak, Claire was the only voice I heard. Each night, after my mother drifted into sleep, Claire and I would head down the hallway to check out the vending machines. The lights in the hospital were unreliable, flickering on and off, with some areas left completely dark when the bulbs gave out. It must have been close to midnight one evening when Claire and I returned from the vending machines. My mother had fallen asleep earlier than usual that night. As we caught up on each other's week and shared a few light-hearted jokes, our conversation was interrupted by a strange cry. The sound came from the direction of the nursery where the newborns were kept. As part of her job, Claire went to investigate, and I followed out of sheer unease and curiosity. Claire entered the nursery first, but before I could step inside, she let out a blood-curdling scream. I rushed in and found her standing there, frozen, staring into a dimly lit corner of the room. I followed her gaze and saw a nightmarish figure. It was thin and skeletal, supporting itself on all fours, with grotesquely elongated arms that were twice the length of its legs. The most horrific feature was its abdomen, out of which grew two misshapen babies. These infants weren't sewn onto the creature or held in place, but rather seemed to be growing out of its body, complete with malformed limbs and faces. We quickly realized the cry we had heard earlier wasn't from the newborns in the nursery. The real source of the sound came from the monstrous babies attached to the creature's abdomen. The newborns in the room, however, had been reduced to unrecognizable, mangled remains. Chewed up and left like half-eaten scraps of meat, the creature held one of the newborns in its grasp, feeding the lifeless body to the hideous infants attached to it. It stopped mid-feeding and slowly turned its attention to us. Without thinking, I grabbed Claire and yanked her out of the room, slamming the door behind us. As we sprinted down the hallway, we caught a glimpse of the creature leaping from one side of the nursery to the other through the window, before it burst through the door and began chasing us. We darted through the hospital's darkened halls, twisting and turning in an attempt to lose the creature. After several frantic moments, we finally lost sight of it. I urged Claire to leave and call for help, but she refused, questioning why I would even think about staying with that thing roaming around. I couldn't bring myself to abandon my mother. I couldn't leave her alone with that creature. Claire, though hesitant, agreed to stay with me no matter what. Unable to change her mind, we crept back into my mother's room as quietly as possible. I gently shook her arm, calling her name softly, then louder as I shook her harder. She remained still and unresponsive. I glanced at the heart monitor, which had been silent for who knows how long. My mother was gone. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually Claire persuaded me to leave. We never encountered the creature again on our way out. When we finally made it to the hospital's exit, the police had already arrived. Apparently, the creature had attacked more people as it escaped. The officers were at a loss as they listened to the bizarre stories of a giant monster preying on newborns. In the end, I gave my mother the funeral she deserved, though it was a small gathering. Just a few family members and close friends who left soon after the priest. Claire and I stayed behind, quietly watching over my mother's grave for a long time. A month or two later, Claire and I decided to return to the now abandoned hospital. Claire had been insistent, despite my hesitation. The hospital administration had told the police that their surveillance cameras had malfunctioned, conveniently leaving no footage of the monster anyone had spoken of. But Claire claimed the cameras had worked perfectly during her time there, which made her suspicious. We combed through the hospital cautiously, half expecting the creature to be lurking around. Though we didn't find much, we did stumble upon a set of classified documents regarding a patient described as neither human nor animal. Some of the accompanying pages were torn out and covered in bizarre symbols I can only describe as demonic or satanic. As we stood there, Claire remarked, "You know, in all the time I worked here, I never once saw a prayer room." I had always felt an odd sense of discomfort when I was near that particular corner of the living room. It was strange, no matter how high I turned up the thermostat, that one spot always stayed unnervingly cold, as if the heat couldn't reach it. At first, I chalked it up to a draft. After all, it was an old house, and drafts were common. But there was something about that coldness that felt different, like it wasn't just the air. Occasionally, late at night, I would get this unsettling sensation, like someone or something was there, watching me from the shadows just out of my line of sight. Each time, I would quickly glance over, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there. It became just another eerie quirk of the house, something I tried to ignore but could never quite shake from my mind. Last night, however, was different. Far worse. It started like any other night. I was getting ready for bed, locking up the house as I did every evening. The routine was the same. Check the doors, turn off the lights, make sure everything was in order. But as I moved toward the corner of the living room to turn off the last lamp, I felt it again. That unmistakable chill creeping up my spine. Only this time, it was stronger, colder than usual. Almost bitter, like I had walked into a freezer. Instinctively, I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and glanced toward the window in that corner, half expecting to see nothing once again. But something was wrong. The window, which was usually clear, was now fogged up. That made no sense. It had been a dry night, no rain, no moisture in the air to cause condensation. Yet the glass was clouded, as though someone had been standing close to it, breathing heavily onto it. I hadn't been anywhere near the window, and I had been alone all evening. My heart began to pound in my chest as I walked slowly toward the window, squinting through the dim light. That's when I noticed it. The breath marks, faint streaks of condensation trailing down the glass, like someone had been standing just on the other side, staring in. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been near that window all night, and yet there they were. I rubbed the glass with my sleeve, hoping to clear the fog, thinking maybe it was just some strange trick of the cold air. But as I wiped away the mist, my stomach twisted in fear. There weren't just breath marks on the inside of where I stood, and another on the outside. My heart raced, pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely think. How could there be breath marks outside? I hadn't heard anyone approach the house, and there was no way anyone could have come that close without me noticing. I wanted to dismiss it, blame it on the cold or some other rational explanation. But deep down, something about it felt incredibly wrong. As I stared at the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, something else started to appear. At first, it was faint, like a smudge or a shadow, but the longer I looked, the clearer it became. There was an outline, vague but undeniably human, standing just beyond the glass. My heart raced, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a reflection. Someone, or something, was standing outside, impossibly close to the window. I stood there, frozen in place, my eyes locked on the figure. Slowly, its features came into focus. A face, pale and unnaturally still, almost pressed against the window, its eyes wide open and staring directly at me. The breath marks on the glass grew thicker as the figure exhaled, and I could see its breath clouding the window, slow and steady. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to run, to turn away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from it. There was something deeply wrong about its face. It was too rigid, too pale, like it wasn't fully human. My body screamed at me to move, but fear rooted me to the spot. Then, as if sensing my growing terror, the figure slowly raised a hand. I watched, horrified, as its palm pressed against the glass. The surface of the window immediately frosted over beneath its touch. My breath came in shallow gasps as the realization hit me. This thing wasn't just outside. It knew I was inside, and it was toying with me. Before I could react, the figure did something even worse. It smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It stretched too wide, far too long for any human face. The expression twisted its features into something grotesque, unnatural. My skin crawled as I watched the smile stretch, distorting the already unsettling face. And then, it tapped on the glass. Once, twice. The sharp sound echoed through the stillness of the house, each tap sending a jolt of fear through me. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled backward, my mind spinning as I tried to comprehend what was happening. I needed to move. I needed to get away from that window. But before I could turn, I heard something else. A sound so faint I almost didn't catch it. Whispering. "Let me in." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried with it an overwhelming sense of dread. The words repeated, just loud enough for me to hear over the pounding of my heart. "Let me in." I backed away from the window, my legs trembling. I didn't dare look again. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and I wasn't about to find out what would happen if I let it in. I bolted from the living room, my heart racing. I locked myself in the bedroom, but even there I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, waiting outside in the cold, dark night. And in the silence I could still hear it. Tap, tap. "Let me in." We arrived at the hospital around 7:30 in the evening. It was me, Jax, along with my partners Ryan, a tall, quiet guy who barely spoke, and Sydney, possibly the most beautiful woman I'd ever met. We stepped out of the all-black van, which had only one identifying mark, a logo featuring 3 arrows pointing toward each other. The hospital had been closed for nearly 30 years after a mysterious event where an unidentified illness wiped out more than half of the patients overnight. It was a single-story building, but sizable for its time. What had once been a modern facility was now covered in moss and mostly boarded up, sitting eerily in the northern part of Florida. "We've arrived at the site," I said into my radio as we started gearing up. We strapped on our protective vests, each carrying 3 extra magazines for our AR-15 rifles. We clipped on side holsters for our Glock 19 pistols, and finally, we put on our helmets, designed to stop small caliber bullets and offer some protection against blunt force. With the building abandoned for so long, we also equipped our night vision goggles. "Copy that, Jax. We're unsure what type of threat you're dealing with, so proceed cautiously. came the response from our support team. "Great," Sydney muttered. She knew the risks all too well, especially since we had almost no intel other than a few reports of explorers going missing in recent months. "Y'all know the drill," I said, looking at Ryan and Sydney. "If they're alive, we rescue them. But the main objective is neutralizing the anomaly." Ryan, standing at least 6 feet 5 inches, gave a quiet nod. As usual, he wasn't much of a talker, but that suited him just fine. We entered the building. I radioed in that we were inside, flipping on our night vision goggles. The tall, dark hallway lit up in a green hue as we made our way forward. There was a front desk with a long hallway behind it, splitting off into 6 smaller hallways where the patient rooms were located. Off to the far left was a kitchen, but we ignored that for now, intending to work our way from the back of the hospital toward the front. We stepped over broken glass and pushed aside abandoned beds as we headed to the end of the hallway. We decided to start with the right-hand hallway, as the left one seemed mostly empty, with just the remains of what appeared to be the rehab section. As we approached room 1, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Pulling out my scanner, I checked for any sign of an anomaly, but nothing registered. This pattern continued as we moved through rooms 2, 3, 4, and 5. When we reached room 6, everything changed. The scanner suddenly began beeping wildly. Silencing it, we exchanged glances and prepared to breach the room. I took point and slowly pushed the door open. What we saw inside made us pause. A hospital room that looked completely untouched, as if it had never been abandoned. Everything seemed normal until we noticed the bathroom door slightly ajar. There was movement inside. I whispered, "I'll take point," nodding at Sydney and Ryan. Kicking open the bathroom door, I was met with the sight of a nurse, seemingly from the 1980s, cleaning the bathroom. "Hello?" I said cautiously. The nurse didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge our presence. "Hello?" I repeated, this time louder, as I reached out to tap her on the shoulder. But when she turned around, what I saw wasn't human, at least not fully. The body, hair, and nails all appeared normal for the time period, but the face was horrific. Her eyes were black with a single white dot in the center. Her mouth hung open unnaturally wide, and from her ears a black liquid oozed. Her nose resembled a skull's hollow void. The creature let out a piercing scream that sent me flying backward, slamming me into the opposite wall. As Sydney and Ryan moved to engage, the entity unleashed a shockwave, knocking Sydney's weapon clear out of her hands and throwing Ryan back against the wall, disarming him. Before he could grab his pistol, the creature grabbed him, screaming into his ear. In an instant, he collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Thinking quickly, I grabbed Sydney and bolted out of the room. Physical force isn't going to work. It overpowered Ryan in a second. Sydney gasped as we ran down the hallway, looking for a place to regroup. "Yeah, we need to keep our distance," I replied. We flipped over a bed and hunkered down behind it, preparing for whatever came next. "My night vision goggles broke," Sydney muttered, frustrated. "Switch to flashlights," I instructed, flipping up my own goggles and turning on the light mounted to my rifle. The hallway illuminated, but there was no sign of the creature. Then we heard it. A sing-song voice echoing through the hall, repeating, "What can Ms. Mary help you with?" It was low, raspy, and haunting. Suddenly, we saw it at the end of the hallway. We opened fire, lighting it up with everything we had. It fell to the ground, unmoving for about 10 seconds, before slowly rising again, repeating its eerie mantra. We reloaded our weapons as it charged toward us at an unnatural speed. It was faster than anything I'd ever seen. We jumped to the side, dodging its attack, and watched as it shot past us. Turning off our flashlights, we tried to conceal ourselves by slipping into the shadows. The creature paused, seemingly disoriented, as it began to search for us. "I don't think it can hear us," I whispered to Sydney as we carefully moved away, backward, down the hallway. The creature turned its head, confused, and we ducked into a nearby room, shutting the door behind us. "How are we going to get out of this one?" Sydney asked, looking at the barred windows. "I don't know," I replied, thinking hard. "One of us could try to distract it while the other lines up a shot." She looked at me with a mix of determination and something more. "Look, I know this isn't the time, but if we make it out of this, what do you think about going on a date?" I smiled, despite the fear. "Sure, but first, we've got to take this thing down." We hatched a plan. I would be the distraction, while Sydney lined up the kill shot. I rushed out of the room, firing at the creature to get its attention. It screeched and charged toward me, screaming, "What can Miss Mary help you with?" Just as it was about to reach me, I turned and fired a few rounds behind me. Sydney moved in, getting close enough to press her gun against the back of its head, and she emptied the magazine. The creature dropped to the ground. Breathing heavily, we reloaded our weapons. I pulled out my pistol and put a few extra rounds into the creature's body, just to be sure. "Ryan's gone, but the creature is down," I radioed in. "We're heading to the entrance to await the cleanup crew." As we walked away, we heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. "What can Miss Mary help you with?" Before I could react, the creature was on its feet again. It grabbed Sydney by the head and lifted her off the ground. I screamed for it to stop, charging at it, but the creature swatted me away like I was nothing. I slammed into the wall, my arm breaking with a sickening snap. Through the pain, I watched in horror as it slowly tore Sydney's head from her body. Her screams echoed through the hallway, but then there was silence. Crying and clutching my broken arm, I staggered to my feet. I ran, barely able to look back, but when I did, I saw it. It was feasting on her. I turned the corner and crashed through the exit door, collapsing just as backup arrived. I woke up later, back at base. That's everything I remember, Doc. The doctor sighed. "You were lucky to survive, Jax. We'll overlook the breach of protocol this time, given the circumstances. But remember, next time, don't get attached." "Yes, sir," I muttered, turning off the recorder in my pocket. "At least people will know about your sacrifice, Sydney," I whispered before walking out. There's a shop on a street I barely remember walking down, though I must have passed it 1,000 times. It's the kind of place you don't think twice about, blending into the dull backdrop of the city. No windows, no displays, just a simple sign hanging from a rusted chain. Unwanted behaviors for sale. I couldn't tell you why I went inside that first time. Curiosity, boredom, maybe it was exhaustion, the kind that sinks in deep when the days start blending together. Either way, I found myself there again today, the door creaking as it closed behind me. The shop was dim, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast long shadows over the shelves. The shelves themselves were lined with jars, simple, unadorned, but each one labeled in the same shaky handwriting: impatience, hesitation, overindulgence, self-doubt. They stretched on endlessly, it seemed, row after row of familiar tendencies. I moved through the aisles slowly, like I always did, not quite sure what I was looking for, but knowing I'd find it. The air was thick, stale, and the soft hum that always filled the room was louder than I remembered. Maybe it was just my head, tired and clouded, but the sound seemed to follow me, clinging to my thoughts like a low, constant buzz. At the counter sat the shopkeeper, just as unremarkable as the shop itself. Middle-aged, balding, with a toothpick hanging loosely from his lips. He barely looked up when I entered, his eyes glued to the small TV beside him, where static flickered over an old infomercial. I wandered through the aisles, picking up a jar labeled Distraction. The glass was cool in my hand, and the contents inside swirled slowly, like smoke trapped in a bottle. I turned it over, reading the label again, feeling a strange sense of familiarity, like I'd held it before. I probably had. "How much for this one?" I asked, more out of habit than anything else. The shopkeeper didn't even glance up from the TV. "You've already paid," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You've been paying for years." The words hit me harder than they should have. Already paid. Of course I had. I'd been paying for it, paying for all of it, long before I ever stepped foot in this place. The late nights spent doing nothing, the endless scrolling through screens, the excuses piled up so high I could barely see over them. I had paid with every wasted moment, every opportunity I let slip by, every hour I spent convincing myself there was always more time. I set the jar back on the shelf, my hands suddenly feeling too heavy. I could hear the hum again, louder now, vibrating through my skull. I glanced at the other jars, regret, nostalgia, apathy. They all seemed to shimmer under the dim light, beckoning me to pick them up, to hold them, to remember how easily they fit in my hands. "You don't need anything new," the shopkeeper said, as if reading my thoughts. "You've got enough already." I looked at him, finally and for the first time. He met my gaze. He wasn't watching the TV anymore. His eyes were on me now, tired and knowing, like he'd seen this scene play out 100 times before. The way he looked at me made me pause, as though he already knew everything I was about to say, and somehow that made the words catch in my throat. I wanted to argue, to tell him that this time was different, that I wasn't like all the others, that I was just browsing, just passing through like a curious observer. But as the thoughts formed, the words felt hollow, empty, and unconvincing before they even reached my lips. I realized then that I didn't need anything new. He was right, and the weight of that truth hit me harder than I expected. These habits, these patterns of behavior, they'd been with me for so long, woven into the fabric of my life so seamlessly that they were now part of me. I'd been paying for them for years, no, longer than that. I had been paying for them in minutes, in days, in moments I couldn't even remember losing. Little pieces of myself chipped away over time, and now here I was, back again, wandering the same aisles, staring at the same shelves, as if caught in some endless loop. The familiarity of it all was unsettling, yet somehow comforting, like an old worn-out sweater I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I walked slowly toward the end of the aisle, my eyes catching on a jar labeled Disillusionment, sitting on the lowest shelf as though waiting for me. I knelt down, hesitating for a moment before reaching out to pick it up. The glass felt cold and heavy in my hands, darker than the others, almost opaque. The contents inside didn't swirl or shift like some of the other jars. They were still, unmoving, dense. It felt as if I were holding the weight of years' worth of disappointment, the quiet erosion of ambition, and the creeping spread of doubt. I knew this one well. It had been with me for longer than I cared to admit, lingering in the shadows, filling the spaces between my aspirations and the reality I faced. "You've already paid for that one, too," the shopkeeper said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a dull knife. I stood up slowly, clutching the jar in my hands, staring down at the label, feeling its familiar weight pressing into my palms. Of course I had. I had paid for it over and over again. With every moment of hesitation, with every dream I let fade into the background, with every time I told myself that nothing mattered anyway, that trying was pointless, I had invested in these habits with time I could never get back. It was a revelation, but it wasn't the kind that brought any comfort or release. Instead, it was the kind that settles deep in your bones, like a heavy ache you can't shake off. The realization that I'd been paying for these habits all along, with days and weeks, with thoughts and actions that had slipped through my fingers like sand. And I would keep paying. I knew that now. Day after day, year after year, until I became nothing more than a collection of these jars, gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. I didn't ask for the price again. I didn't need to. I set the jar back on the shelf, feeling its weight leave my hands but not my chest. It stayed with me, pressing down on my ribcage, a constant reminder of all the time I'd spent, all the chances I'd wasted. "You'll be back," the shopkeeper said, shifting the toothpick between his teeth, his eyes drifting lazily back to the static on the screen, as though our exchange was already forgotten. I nodded, not because I wanted to agree, but because deep down I knew he was right. I always came back. As I walked out of the shop and into the gray, lifeless street, the hum from inside the store still buzzed faintly in my ears, a lingering echo of everything I'd left behind. The door creaked shut behind me, the sound punctuating the stillness of the street. Above, the old sign swayed gently in the wind. "Unwanted behaviors for sale," it read, as if it had always been there, as if it always would be. I kept walking, my feet moving mechanically, my mind heavy with the knowledge that no matter how far I went, no matter how much I wanted to leave it behind, I would be back. I always came back.